In the back, or mic up a little bit? It's good? Okay. So before we jump into some new material, and we're going to finish up our data security unit today, does anybody have any questions about anything we talked about last time or things moving forward? Yes? So are you writing it essay format or using headers? That's your choice. I don't really care that much. I mean, I put in the outline, or sort of in the rubric there, what I thought the parts were. If you want to use those as section headings, that's fine. If you just want to write it as an essay format and not have them, that's fine too. I'm not that particular. Just make sure it includes the detail that needs to be included. Yep. This is not a writing class. I'm not going to get that picky. Other questions? Okay, then if not, so like I said, we're going to finish our data security unit today. Remember that homework is due on Wednesday at this time, and we'll have the quiz next Monday in class. And then we'll get started. So I see a lot of you saw my email yesterday and brought digital devices with you. I don't think we'll get to the in-class activity today, but we'll certainly get there on Wednesday if we don't. But thank you for bringing computers along with you. Okay, so if you recall, last time, we finished up our discussion of sort of modular arithmetic and other elements of number theory. So we were looking at what are prime numbers, what were relatively prime numbers, and we had started to turn our focus back. Now, how do we use all of those number theory ideas to actually make cryptography happen? And so we spent a little bit of time going back over that Diffie-Hellman example, where we sort of took that paint analogy that we had discussed earlier in the week and started to put numbers behind it. How do we get Bob and Alice to agree on that number K without actually having to transmit that number through an insecure channel? And we saw how that worked, and at the end of the day, what we were discussing at the very end of class last time was this RSA system, which is essentially how modern computers actually handle cryptography. So the algorithm that we're presenting here is not necessarily that different from what your computer is going to actually be using. We're going to get into the very ends of the nuts and bolts today in class. But the idea that we would start with is we're now going to let the system be what we're going to call asymmetric. When we were doing Diffie-Hellman, when we had that paint example, both Bob and Alice, whether they were the sender or the receiver, did the same things. They followed the same steps, and then they sort of shared similar information with each other. When we start going to RSA to actually start doing the encryption, what we're going to have is now an asymmetric system where the sender and the receiver are going to follow two different sets of steps. And in particular, what's going to happen is now we're going to have this key pair, this public and private key, associated with each individual user. And so when you're wanting to send information to me, you're going to request my public key to send information to me. If you wanted to send information to someone else securely, you would have to contact them and say, what is your public key? I want to send you a message. And then when you send something to me, I'm going to use my own private key, which acts as the inverse of the public key that I gave you, to actually do the decryption. Okay? And so in this way, the sender and the receiver are going to follow two slightly different steps when they're having to work this. And the way that it largely works is sort of graphically depicted here on the slide, where the sender is going to start with whatever their text is. They're going to get the public key from the receiver and use that key to actually do the encryption. We didn't get into the details of how that worked last time, but we'll certainly get there today. Once they've encrypted that message, which it turns out is fairly straightforward to do, it might be a little bit tedious, but it's one equation. Okay, we'll get there in about 20 minutes. They then have this encrypted data, which they're going to send across the channel, which is now in principle secure. Okay, is it actually secure? Can Eve intercept? Can an eavesdropper always pick up that encrypted data? Yep. And does Eve, as our eavesdropper, know the algorithm for how to decrypt the data? Well, yes and no. She knows the exact algorithm, but what she doesn't know is what's the key. Okay, so if Eve had the receiver's private key, would Eve be able to decipher the message without any issue? Yep. Does Eve know a way to sort of do guess and check to figure out what is the receiver's private key? Sure. It's expensive. Okay, so again, the idea here is Eve knows the algorithm that's being used, Eve knows the process that's being used for encryption and decryption, but without knowing that receiver's private key, it's extremely expensive for her to actually go about cracking the message. Okay, and that's why when you see sort of either read novels or you see shows on TV talking about the NSA trying to crack these things, you see big supercomputers working in the backdrop because they're, as far as I know, basically going through brute force and just trying a whole bunch of combinations, seeing which one actually cracks the message. And it turns out this requires a lot of computational effort. So then finally, our receiver gets the encrypted message. Our receiver happens to have their own private key. At least they should. If they don't, something's horribly wrong. They can then use that private key to decrypt the message. They get back out the original sort of plain text message, as it's called in this slide, which then has the message saying, hi. Okay, I don't know if you'd really need to encrypt a message that simple, but you could without a problem. And that's the general idea. Okay, so we've talked about all those details, and this is where we left off last time, which was, first of all, trying to figure out how does a particular person set up this private and public key pair. So again, we've already sort of seen every person who's going to want to communicate using RSA is going to have their own set of keys. This is sort of like a digital online identity, if you will, saying I'm me and you're you. You've got your set of keys, I've got mine. And so how does this work? And so to recap what we discovered last time, basically each person is going to start up here at step 1 by picking 2 prime numbers, and we'll call them P and Q. Okay. For the examples we're going to work in class, some of you have already started looking at the homework, and number 5 deals with RSA a little bit. We're not going to use particularly large prime numbers in class. We don't need to get the point across. But in practice, when your computer's doing this and you're actually going to send a secure message like an email or an online banking transaction, your private and public keys were generated with incredibly large prime numbers. P and Q are probably each about 100 digits long, if not longer. Okay? So these are big numbers, even though to understand sort of the workings of it, we don't need to go that big. So step 1, just choose any 2 prime numbers. Done. Step 2, compute their product. N equals P times Q, which is to say P times Q is the prime factorization of N. Jumping down to the bottom, because we discussed this a little bit last time, what we can see is that that value n, the product of those prime numbers, is part of our public key. So that's something we are widely disseminating. If you want to send me a message, I will tell you what is the product of those 2 prime numbers. That's free. You're welcome to have that information. And this is what makes the RSA secure in practice right now, is determining P and Q simply given n. What are those 2 prime numbers that had to be multiplied together is an incredibly expensive process, especially as P and Q get very, very large. Okay? And so that's what limits Eve. When she intercepts the message, she can get my public key. I'm willing to share it with anyone, but it's going to take her, I don't know, maybe a year, maybe 10 years to figure out what were P and Q from the N that's in my public key. Okay? So once we have that product, which is also maybe not that hard to calculate, might be tedious again, but not that bad, what we can do is then select, again, at random, some encryption key that we'll call little e that satisfies a couple conditions. First of all, we're going to have e be between 1 and P minus 1 times Q minus 1. Okay? And then the second condition is that e has to be relatively prime to P minus 1, Q minus 1, which is to say it doesn't share any prime factors with that. And a way to verify that very nicely is to just look at the greatest common divisor and see, is the GCD between E and P minus 1, Q minus 1 equal to 1? Okay? In many cases, there are quite a few different encryption keys we could choose. Given whatever your P and Q are, there could be hundreds of possible values E. You just have to pick one that satisfies these conditions. Okay? And then lastly, for step 4, once we've got P and Q, we've got N, we've got E, we need to find our decryption value, this lowercase d, that satisfies these 2 conditions. One, when we take the product E times D, and we take modulus P minus 1, Q minus 1, we get that that's equal to 1. And one of the conditions that we can also put on that we could get out of the first one, but we'll specify it anyway, is that D is between 0 and P minus 1, Q minus 1. Okay? Why do we have to place these conditions on D and E? Is it because mathematicians are thrifty and they just feel like putting restraints on things? Why do we have those? Is it to make life complicated? Anybody want to take a guess? Okay, so the whole idea, we discussed this concept briefly a little while ago. Remember when we were talking about sort of what are inverse relations? Which is to say, if we have some operation where we can perform something and we get something out, an inverse relation takes us back from whatever that output is back to the input we put in. Do we want our RSA encryption routine to have an inverse, such that if we encrypt the data, we have a decryption algorithm that serves as an inverse? Do we want that? Which is to say, if I encrypt something and send it to you and you decrypt it, that you get out the exact thing I put in. Do we want that? Yeah. It turns out when we start appealing to the number 3, and this is more detail than we're going to go into when we work through these examples, but these conditions that we have to place on D and E are necessary to guarantee that our decryption algorithm is the inverse of our encryption algorithm. Which is to say, it will guarantee when these conditions are met, that when we do the following steps on the next couple slides, everything's going to work okay. And if you do the proper decryption to the encryption, you will get back the original message. If we didn't have these conditions, that still might work, but we're not guaranteed it will. And in that case, do we necessarily want to use that as an encryption strategy? Not really. Okay? So that's why we have these conditions. And anyway, when all of this is done, what we end up finding is our public key is just going to be these two values. We'll have that n, what's the product of those two prime numbers, and what's that value e that we chose randomly that meets those conditions listed in step 3. And we are happy to share these two values with anyone who asks. They can use that. That's our public key. They can use that to encrypt their message to send to us. What we keep to ourselves, again, why we call it the private key, we'll have our two prime numbers, P and Q. We're not actually going to use those all that much, but we'll keep them. But more specifically, we're going to keep that decryption key D private. Okay? We're not going to tell anyone what that is. And that's what's going to allow us, and us alone, to quickly decrypt any message that's sent using our public key for the encryption. Okay? Any questions on this before we dive into now how do we use these public and private keys, these 5 values, to actually do RSA? And hopefully you'll see that the setup here takes a little bit of time, but the actual algorithms work pretty nicely. Okay, so let's take an example and look at actually doing the setup, and we'll go back and forth between this slide and the previous one as we work through this. So, step 1 on the last slide, we had just choose prime numbers. In principle, we want them to be large. So let's pick large values like 7 and 13. Okay, so what's n? Right, so we get n, well, n is just the product of the two prime numbers, so it's just 7 times 13, which happens to be 91. Okay, well, that wasn't too bad. Well, that's sort of here in step 2, we have this p minus 1, q minus 1. Notice in the setup that product of p minus 1 times q minus 1 appears quite a few places. So let's just go ahead and take a minute and figure out what that is. In that case, what's p minus 1 times q minus 1? Okay, well, p minus 1 is just 6, and q minus 1 is 12, and 6 times 12 is 72. Okay, so that's not too bad. So what we can now do, thinking back a moment here, going to step 3, so we've got our p, we've got our q, we've got n. We know p minus 1, q minus 1. We need to select an encryption key e, so it's between 1 and 72. And it's relatively prime to 72, which is to say, again, the greatest common divisor between whatever our key E and 72 is just equal to 1. Is 29 is a value, is that something we could choose legitimately? Well, is it between 1 and 72? Yep. And what do you think? Is it going to be relatively prime to 72? Yep. Okay, well, so first tip off, is 29 actually a prime number itself? Yes, it is. So is it relatively prime to some other number? Yep. It has to be. Unless the other number is a multiple of 29, and is 72 a multiple of 29? The answer is no. Okay. So is that a valid encryption key using the conditions that we had on the last slide? Yeah, we can choose e equals 29. Could we have chosen a different value? Would like e equals 51 have worked? Sure. Okay. We could have chosen a whole bunch of things, so long as whatever value we chose was relatively prime to that p minus 1, q minus 1, or 72 in this example. Okay? And so the last thing, we can then go on to solve to find that d is going to have to be equal to 5. So once we've specified the p, the q, the n, and we get the e, it's a matter of solving this equation here to get d. Actually going about solving this, because of the modular arithmetic, gets into a little bit more than I want to go into in this class. So what we're going to do is I'll give you a solution and we'll test can we verify. For, again, those of you that looked at the homework, I'm going to give you on the setup problem for RSA about 3 different potential d values and ask you which one is the decryption key. So if you have e and I give you a possible d, can you verify that it's the correct one? I'm not going to ask you to actually solve for it. Okay? So what we can do in this example is we can suppose that d is equal to 5. Well, what we can end up doing is then going back and verifying, is that ed mod p minus 1 q minus 1 equal to 1? And so if we go and look at that, you might already surmise that the answer in fact is yes. We set this up the right way. But to see that, what we can do is take e was 29. Okay, hold on, I got to calibrate the board here. It's off a little bit. Happy Monday. Okay, let's try that again. And so what we can get, much better. So we get our ed mod p minus 1 q minus 1. So e is just 29. We're saying our d is supposedly 5. And we need to take that mod 72. Okay, what's 29 times 5? Is it 145? Yes. So we get 145 mod 72. Is that a particularly, are either of those particularly large numbers? Okay, so anybody know what the answer to this is? Okay, so a couple people are thinking 1. Easy way to say that, what's 72 times 2? 144, so what's 145 mod 72? It's 1. Okay. So what that's telling us is e times d mod 72 equal to 1. Yep. So is that our proper decryption key given the value e equals 29? Yep. So we now have our public and private keys set up. We've got all these values calculated. I don't think that was too bad. And so then we want to ask now that we have p and q and n and e and d and all of these values floating around, what's our what's our public key, what's our private key? And so again, we can go back to our previous slide. Public key is just our e value used for encrypting, and that n value, what's the product of those two prime numbers? And then our private key is everything else. So when we put all that together, we get our public key. Well, e was just equal to 29. And the product of the two primes was 91, what we found earlier. So that's the public key that we'll disseminate to anyone who asks, just those two numbers. And for our private key, we're going to keep our value d equals 5, private to us. That's what we will use to decrypt, because we know that's the correct value to use. We don't necessarily want everyone else to know that. And we'll keep our two prime numbers, the 7 and 13 that we originally started with, although at this point we're probably not going to need them very much anymore. Okay? But that's all there is to setting up RSA. Was any part of this necessarily that complicated? Not really. I mean, maybe it's a bit tedious, but not hard. Okay, so now that we have that set up and we've got these public keys, we've got these private keys, how do we actually go about doing the encrypting and decrypting? I mean, that's what we're actually after. And so let's take a moment and discuss encryption first, and it turns out it's pretty straightforward. So again, when we encrypt, we're going to go to the receiver and say, send me your public key. Okay? So we're not using our own key values to do this operation. But I'm going to send you a message. So I'm going to ask you, send me your private or your public key. Well, I'm going to ask you, send me your private key, and the answer to that request is shove off. Okay? Don't send me your private key. Do not ever send me your private key. You should not trust me or anyone else. Okay? But you can send me your public key. That's fine. And so what we're going to get is the receiver's public key, those values E and N, that encryption value and that product of the two prime numbers. And again, do we necessarily know what those two prime numbers are from this information? No, we don't. We only know their product. Okay? And so what we're now going to do is say that we want the message that we're going to send to be called little m. Okay, M for message. And so what we have to do is, first of all, make sure that m is between 0 and n, and that m and n are relatively prime. Okay, again, why are we going to put those restrictions on our message? Why do we have to put those there? So it's going to guarantee that the encryption and the decryption are inverses of each other. If we don't have this condition, again, we're not guaranteed to have that. And so that's going to be important. Now, in practice, this isn't a problem. If n is the product of two extremely large prime numbers, what are the chances that m is going to be between 0 and n? Pretty good, because what's the product of 200-digit long numbers? Really, really big number. Okay, so that's probably not too big of a deal. And remember, for m and n to be relatively prime, what that means is that if we took the prime factorization of m and of n, there are no common factors. How many numbers are in the prime factorization of n? How many prime numbers are there inside n? There's just two. It's whatever our receiver originally used as P and Q. So what? And those, remember, those are very large numbers. What are the chances, do you think, that our message happens to have one of those extremely large prime numbers as a factor? Almost zero. It's in practice not going to happen. So in practice, these are not really those big of restrictions, but we do necessarily have to check that they're true. But the number of times where there's going to be an issue is going to be very, 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 very small. Okay, so once that's done, we have our message, we have our receiver's public key, we can actually do the encryption, and all we're going to do is compute m to the e. So take our message, raise it to that encryption power, mod n. That's it. That's the encryption. Everything, all of our data security is built on that. Is that really all that complicated? No. Again, really tedious? Yeah, maybe. Hard? Not so much. So we can now do a quick example. And so suppose we'll carry down, this is our encryption value from the last slide when we were setting up the key value, and that was our n value. And suppose our message is 59. What's the encrypted message that's actually sent? So what do we have to do to actually to perform this encryption? Do we have all the information we need? Yeah, we've got our message, it's 59. And do we have our receiver's public key? Yep, we've got E is 29, N is 91. So all we have to do for encryption is just calculate A equals, so we'll have M, which is our 59, raise it to the E power, 29, and mod that by n. Okay, 59 to the 29. Does that seem like a big number or a small number? It seems like a big number. In fact, if anyone's got a calculator and you try putting that in, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to basically error your calculator out. That's too big. But as we saw last week, thinking about sort of with this modulus on the end, doing modular exponentiation, is this necessarily that hard to compute? We can just sort of keep breaking that power down in half. And so we could say, well, this is going to be the product of 59 to the 15th power mod 91 times 59 to the 14th power mod 91, which those might still be too large, but we can sort of split them in half again and again and again and again and again, using exactly the examples that we had last week. But we can compute this. It might take 20 minutes, or if you're really cheap, the way that I would recommend doing it. Come over here, Wolfram Alpha, type in 59 to the 29 mod 91. Takes it a moment. Okay, again, check your input. Did it right. And it displays our result is 89. Okay, that's not bad. For those of you that want a good laugh, you can also look down here and see the result on a 91-sided clock. I don't know, just if you're looking for something sort of crazy in the morning.
It makes the clock like 91, take it back to the beginning.
Yep, because it's trying to do the clock math of showing the modular, everything wraps around once you hit that modulus again. Anyway, so we see then that our value, what we ended up getting out, was indeed 89. So what's the message that's actually sent? 89. Do we know how to convert that to ones and zeros? Sure, we can just use our binary numbers, send it through, done. We're halfway there. That's encryption. Any questions on that before we touch decryption? Okay. So we get our 89. And so how does decryption work? So now we receive a message that someone encrypted using our public key. So they used our E value and our value of n. And we have our private key. So we've got the value D, we've got P and Q. To decrypt our message, all we're going to do is take their encrypted message, which we'll call A, raise it to that Dth power, again, where we know that D, that's our decryption key from when we set up all of the stuff, and just take that modulus n. It's basically the same operation that the receiver did. They took their message, raised it to the E value for encryption, mod n. We take their encrypted value, raise it to the D power for decryption, mod n, and that's that. What do you expect if we were to plug in, so we have our A was 89 from the last slide. D, what was our D value? Does anybody remember from maybe 2 or 3 slides ago? I think it was 5. And n is 91. If we compute that through, what do you think m is going to be? Well, we look back here and we started m is 59. Should it be 59? Yeah, because we want to make sure we get the message that they actually encrypted. Okay? And so sure enough, we can go through and do that. So again, we received A equals 89. We could go back and see that our D value, I think it was 5. Yep, D is 5. And so when we compute now 89 to the 5th modulo 91, our A to the D mod n, we should get 59. And again, we'll come back over here and verify that real quick, where we can just make it, what was it now? We had our 89 to the 5th, mod 91, and sure enough, we got 59 back out. So that's a good thing, because that said, we put in 59 to encrypt, sent it through. When we came back and decrypted it, we got what we put in. That's a really good sanity check. Okay? But that's all there is to encrypting and decrypting. So like I said, we needed a lot of this modular arithmetic to understand how these operations work. We needed that exponentiation. We needed to talk about prime numbers. But the actual workings of RSA don't need much more than that. This is what your computers are doing. When you're sending secure emails or doing online banking, this is what's going on underneath the hood. It's not really that complicated at all. But the idea is it makes it very hard. Eve has an almost impossible time trying to determine the P and Q values from n. And without knowing P and Q, it is nearly impossible for her to determine what is D. What is that decryption key, which enables the decryption step here, that A to the D mod n. It's not that Eve can't find it out, it's just that it's really, really expensive to do so. And that's what makes the system work. Any questions on then the encrypting and decrypting with RSA? Okay, then if not, the last thing I want to talk about in this unit is this idea of signing messages. So because we have this asymmetric relationship where when you're sending an encrypted message, you're always using the receiver's key values. Okay? So you want to send me a message, you ask for my public key, I give it to you, you encrypt using my public key, send it to me, and then I use my private key to decrypt. How do I know the message came from you? Could someone just put in their message, hey, this is from Bob, and send it to me, even knowing full well that Eve is actually sending the message, and just put in her message, hey, this is from Bob? Should I then trust that the message is actually from Bob? No. So how do I verify, how do I know that Bob sent the message to me? Well, using key values, again, remember, this idea of this public and private key is like a digital online identity. So what Bob can do is he can sign his message before he encrypts it to say, hey, I'm Bob. Encrypts the message, sends it to me. When I decrypt it, there's now a signature that Bob has put in there using his key values that I can go and verify, is this from Bob? Okay? It sort of works in the other way, because now what Bob's going to do is encode something in his message using his private key that I can verify using his public key. So he'll send me the message, I decrypt it using my information, and then I go to Bob saying, well, I think this message came from Bob. Bob, what's your public key? Bob sends it to me. And I use his public key on that part that he encoded in the message to say, when I use your public key, do I get, hey, this is Bob, or do I get gibberish, gibberish, gibberish? Because if I get a bunch of gibberish using Bob's public key to look at that value, what does that indicate? It didn't come from Bob. Okay? I don't know who it came from, but it wasn't Bob. Okay? And so we can have this idea of using these key values, again, as sort of identification to verify. And so in that way of sort of embedding that information in the message, we can verify the identity of the sender as well. And so just as the one note here, when we say, you know, Alice uses her private key to sign the message, does she actually embed her private key in the message? What do you think? No. Why shouldn't she do that? Well, because then she's given out her private key, and then all of a sudden, any message sent to Eve, I know how to decrypt. Or any message, sent to Alice, I now know how to decrypt. Do we necessarily want that? No. And so what's going to happen is it's going to go through a similar sort of encryption and decryption cycle like what we had on the last slide, pretty much going in the opposite direction. It fundamentally works the same. We don't need to go through an example. But just as this is the idea of, again, these public and private keys are your identification, and you can use them to check and validate identifications, as well as doing the encrypting and decrypting. But anyway, that basically ends our data security unit. So does anybody have any questions before we start something completely different? Okay, so this also then ends for the last, month and a half. We've been talking predominantly about digital devices. We sort of started with that data storage unit. How do we convert everything to ones and zeros? We looked at data transmission. How do we send things back and forth? Now we've looked at data security. How do we encrypt and decrypt? We're done with digital devices. You now have a pretty good understanding of how computers work and what are a lot of the things they're doing. And we're going to talk about something completely different. So we will move on to our next unit. And so we're going to start talking about today organ donation. Yes? You got a question about? Yeah, data security. What's up? Yep. Okay, so the question is, we had discussed briefly last time the idea that quantum computing is going to break a lot of the cryptography that we're using in RSA. Is that because quantum computers can do things that other computers can't, or because they can do things faster? The answer to both questions is both. There are things quantum computers can do that classical computers can't, but then more specifically, there are a whole bunch of things quantum computers can do faster than conventional computers. And it turns out actually doing prime number factorizations of an integer is trivial on a quantum computer. And so should a quantum computer become available right now, I would send you maybe my public key, because you want to send me a piece of information which has n in it. Conventional computers like what we're using cannot determine p and q in a good amount of time. It takes them a long time to figure out p and q just given what n is. Quantum computers can do it very, very quickly. And all of a sudden, Eve no longer would have to wait maybe 1 year or 5 years to determine what are those p and q values to then be able to decrypt the message. She could get those p and q values in under 3 seconds.
So
making the prime numbers bigger actually doesn't change anything. And so when these quantum computers become available, we're going to need to use a completely different algorithm. The idea still being that everybody knows what the pieces are, but without having complete information, it's impractical to solve. We're going to need a different set of algorithms that are impractical to solve on a quantum computer. And this is certainly an ongoing area of active research, knowing that this is still probably about 10 to 20 years down the road, but it's going to be here sooner rather than later. And the moment it is here, cybersecurity as we know it right now is dead. Yep. Thanks for asking. Other questions? Okay. So like I said, we're going to start something a little bit new. And so just as a moment, so we're now basically halfway through the semester, and just put in a slide here to give you a little bit of an overview, sort of the back half of this class. You know, as I said, so far we've been focusing on digital devices and how they work and all that. The remaining units that we're going to discuss are maybe a little bit more eclectic, where in terms of the technology, where before we sort of had, here's the technology, we're looking at a computer or smartphone or tablet in some way, and maybe sort of the math concepts from one unit to another were completely disparate and independent. It's now going to be sort of the other way around, where now our technologies are going to be a little eclectic, where you're going to look and say, well, go look at the syllabus and look at what we've got left and think, okay, there's no relationship between these technologies, you're right. What we're going to see is, at least in a very light way, the math concepts are going to start to build on each other a little bit more. And that's going to be sort of our theme from one unit to the next. But they're going to be sort of different sets of math concepts. So one of the things that I know you're all going to groan about is we're going to see a lot fewer equations. Okay? There's going to be a lot less of the, here's a bunch of numbers, plug them in and calculate something. And what we're going to see a lot more of are figures, drawings, and procedures. And what comes in the back half of the course. So I know you're all really disappointed about that. But I promise, we'll all get through it together. Okay? But I just wanted to make you aware of that. So I think one of the neat things as we're jumping in is, before we get into the ideas of organ donation, is to step back and sort of remind ourselves that not all modern technologies are digital devices. Not all of them use digital devices. And so just take a moment and try to brainstorm, what are some technologies that don't require computers or digital devices? Modern technologies. Can you think of, what are some really good modern technologies that don't need digital devices? Okay, pencil. Is pencil really a modern technology? Okay, you want to say the mechanical pencil, I'll meet you halfway. But sure, we don't need digital devices yet for our pencils. Okay, sharpener again, is it a modern? What are some modern technologies that don't require digital devices? They have to be out there.
A car.
Okay, so a car is a pretty modern device. Of course, there now are computers in cars, and you've got your nice Sirius XM satellite radio and all of that stuff. But the actual fundamental operation of a car doesn't need a computer. We can have better diagnostics, better sensors, all of that, sure, fine. But the actual internal combustion engine does not need a computer, absolutely. What are some other technologies? I think we can do even a little bit more modern than a 19th century thermodynamic vehicle. Yep?
Sliding door.
A sliding door, okay. What else? What other ideas? Yep?
A rocket.
A rocket. Again, sort of like the car, we've got, here's the big engine and all that goes in, but we can use computers to sort of make better diagnostics and better sensors, but they're not fundamentally necessary for the operation. Sure. I've got a whole list of examples. No one's even close to some of the ones I've come up with so far. Think outside the box. What are some things that have been developed in the last, let's say, 20 to 30 years that don't need digital devices? Yep. Massage chair. Okay. Sure. We can go with that. Okay, well, here's the list of some things that I've come up with. So how many of you have used high-efficiency laundry detergent? Is that a modern technology? Does it do better than traditional detergents? Yeah. Is that because chemists just suddenly decided, let's mix random things together? And, oh, look, this one gets rid of cranberry stains better than the other stuff. No, this was designed. What makes something the high-efficiency laundry detergent? Why is this better than conventional detergents? Okay, I mean, we're not going to discuss this in great detail, but what's the difference? Okay, so the ingredients, absolutely, but what's sort of the key thing? How many of you are bio majors of some sort? I know there should be at least half the class. That's what I thought. It's biotechnology. What's different in high-efficiency laundry detergents? They're using enzymes. And they went and sort of back-processed how do bacteria get rid of these things and digest them down. And they designed a bunch of enzymes that are really good at digesting dirt or other organic stains that don't just require soap. I mean, historically, how did conventional laundry detergents work? It's just soap. You have your laundry machine. Everyone knows the agitator inside the laundry machine. Sort of just make sure that everything just sort of keeps bumping into itself as it's washing around. That was how soap worked. You had to just basically concussively contact the soap with the stain, and it would get it out. The enzymes don't need that. You can put them in solution. So if you've got at home, or I don't know what the dorms here have, one of the new washing machines that are designed to be high efficiency, has anybody used one or seen one? Do they have an agitator? No, they don't need one. You can put in the high efficiency laundry detergent, and basically it's in solution. The enzymes just sort of go through the solution and they just pick out the stains and pull them out. You don't need to keep, beating all of your clothes and soap together in the washing machine. And so that reduces the amount of energy that the washing machine needs because it doesn't have to twirl this big agitator around. And it actually produces better soap. Okay, that's a modern technology. Were any digital devices harmed in the creation of, or in the use of high efficiency laundry detergent? No. Okay, compact fluorescent light bulbs. Anybody used one? I mean, I think they're basically required by law at this point. You have a hard time finding incandescents. What's the idea here? They produce just as much luminosity as traditional incandescents, and they require, in most cases, about 1/10 of the amount of energy. Okay, so they're much more energy efficient, but they're modern. I mean, they've been on the market maybe now for about, I'm going to round up and say 20 years. How many of you have spilled, well, you're probably too young to say wine. Let's go with grape juice. Has anyone spilled grape juice on a pair of khaki pants before? Okay, or on other sorts of pants, or you spilled it, your family just put in this wonderful new white carpet at home and your dog did something. Great. Okay, anybody had something like that happen to them? Okay, and so you get this horrible stain. What about stain-resistant pants? Does anybody own a pair of stain-resistant pants? Really? No one? Okay, I did not wear mine today. I wasn't expecting to spill anything on them. But the idea is, these are a very modern invention where there's this nanotechnology where we can put a very thin film of material on top of the fabric for our pants that repels water. And so if we were to spill something like water or grape juice or something like that, instead of being absorbed into the fabric, it just wicks off. Because there's this very thin, as far as the human eye is concerned, transparent layer of material that's saying to the liquid, get off. Go onto the carpet, stain that. Because that's cheaper to fix than the pair of pants, but okay. That's a modern technology. How many of you have used non-stick cookware? Okay, a bunch of hands go up. Modern technology. Did we have that 50 years ago? No. How did you make cookware non-stick in the 1950s? Lard. Put a bunch of Crisco or a stick of butter in the pan, heated it up, and moved on with life. Okay? For sort of a fun one, we're in the fall right now. It's apple season. What's your favorite type of apple? Okay, Granny Smith, sure. Anybody thinking Red Delicious? Does anybody actually think Red Delicious apples are good? Put your hand down. Red Delicious apples are awful. And so, in recent years, at least sort of the consensus is that these Honeycrisp apples have come on the scene. Has anybody had Honeycrisp apples? Okay, they're usually pretty sweet. They've got a nice texture to them and all that. These, as it turns out, were engineered. Honeycrisp apples did not occur by chance, much as the Red Delicious apple didn't occur by chance either. But if you're curious, I mean, Honeycrisp apples in some sense are in that way a modern technology. They were optimized over about 20 to 30 years to develop really good taste, really good texture, in contrast with other apples like the Red Delicious, which were optimized to, what were Red Delicious apples designed to do? Have a beautiful red exterior. So what happened to the inside of the apple? You get a soggy, mushy, tasteless, ugh. It's just awful. Don't buy Red Delicious apples. That's the take-home part of this lecture. But if you're curious, they haven't stopped at Honeycrisp apples, and there's a bunch of engineers and botanists working on producing even better apples. And if you're an apple enthusiast like I am, you might be looking forward to fall 2019 when the successor to the Honeycrisp apples is supposed to be made available nationwide. If you're in the state of Washington right now, you can find them, but they haven't really been exported this far east. But be on the lookout. Cosmic Crisps are coming, and the early reviews are really good. I have not had one, so I can't speak to whether they're good or not, but there's a link there if you're curious about sort of what went into how they actually produced Honeycrisp apples and thinking of this as a technology. There's a link. Just be warned, in about the second paragraph, there is one F-bomb. I know you're all offended. It's a great article otherwise. Okay, but I mean, are there other types, now that we've maybe got our brains thinking a little bit different direction, can you think of other modern technologies that don't require digital devices?
Wrinkle-resistant shirts.
Sorry, what was it? Yes, we can get wrinkle-resistant clothing, just as we sort of had stain-resistant. Absolutely. So we've designed better materials that don't crease and form those permanent structures better. But that's absolutely modern technology. Yep. Okay, so the Invisalign sort of braces are things where you don't have to have the brackets and the rubber bands popping out all the time. Yeah, wouldn't that have been nice? Yeah. Okay, so dogs are modern technology. I mean, certainly technology they were designed, I'm not necessarily sure that's modern. We domesticated the dog a while ago. A domesticated cat would be a modern technology. We certainly have tame cats. I'm not entirely sure they're domesticated. The idea of domestication is the animal can't survive without you, and dogs basically don't know what to do if a human's not present. Cats are just fine. They certainly appreciate you giving them food and picking up their poop every day, but you know, they'll be fine without it. Other ideas? Yep. Okay, roses again. I mean, so any of these plants that have been sort of bred over the years, you could make an argument. Yep. So lint roller, that probably goes back maybe about 50 years, at least in the modern sense. Something like that. Yep. Right, so something like the heat or temperature protective thermoses and water bottles that are either going to keep your beverage cold or keep your beverage hot. That's absolutely a modern invention. How do we design materials that are very good thermal insulators that don't sort of let heat flow between what's inside and what's outside? Absolutely. Okay, so the idea is, get your brains thinking. There are a lot of technologies out there. Velcro. Modern technology. No digital devices. You might make fun of someone for having Velcro on their shoes. Okay, that's your prerogative, but whatever. It's useful in a lot of places. But there are a ton of possibilities. And so what I want to do coming off of this big unit on digital devices is spend a little bit of time talking about technologies that don't require digital devices. We're going to talk about one specifically, and as you saw from the cover slide, you've seen from the syllabus, it's the idea of organ donation. Is organ donation a modern technology? In the broadest of senses, yes. Okay, so we can go back and you can look at history. There's a really nice discussion and sort of timeline on Wikipedia. The link is there. So if you really want to think about organ donation beyond just sort of, quote unquote, old wives' tales, first organ donation started back in the 1800s. It's about 200 years ago now. It was like the 1820s, where people started doing skin grafts. So someone might get a really bad burn or something, and you could go and actually try to graft skin either from another part of their body or from some other donor onto that to try to help them recover faster. Okay, so in that sense, maybe this isn't entirely modern, but when we think organ donation today, do you necessarily think skin graft? No, you're thinking like an internal organ. Something like we know we can do heart transplants. We can do, in certain cases, liver transplants. We can do kidney transplants. There's all sorts of internal organs, and that is very much modern. It's within about the last, certainly 60 to 70 years, the first internal organ, it was a kidney, was only transplanted basically in 1950. That wasn't all that long ago. And certainly the number of organs that can now be done has just increased tremendously since then. The viability rate of the surgeries has gone way up. We've learned more about different aspects about why do people reject different organs, and we've been able to produce therapies to make sure that that's better so that when we try to do the transplant surgery, they're more successful. We've found ways to do different organs entirely. But this is now a modern technology, and so the picture we've got here was actually from, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago. It was a face transplant where this guy, I believe he was in Poland, got into a horrible car accident and completely disfigured the front of his skull, and they were able to do a complete face transplant to try to restore, a normal-looking face to this man. Even probably 20 years ago, would that have been possible? No. And so did that have a huge impact on his quality of life moving forward? Almost certainly. And so without having to get into big digital devices or use computers, we can be changing the world and actually improving the quality of life in a lot of ways by considering what are some of these other technologies. So maybe one of the questions, who are organ donors? Okay, so if we're going to talk about organ donation, where do the donated organs come from? Well, historically, where did they come? Where do they still mostly come from? Cadavers. They come from dead people. Okay, so I mean, at least in the United States, most donated organs come from cadavers, which is to say someone met an untimely end, but by and large they were relatively healthy, or at least certain organs were. We can take those organs with their consent and donate them to other people. So the way that this is usually done in the United States is it's through the driver's license program. So each state has their own different set of regulations, but like in the state of New York, when you go to apply for your driver's license, you can check the box there to say, are you willing to be an organ donor or not? New York, at least back in about 2010, I don't know if they're still doing it, did an experiment with actually making organ donation opt-out. So most states it's opt-in. When you go to fill out your driver's license, you have to physically check the box and sign, otherwise you are not a registered organ donor. And New York was one of the first states to play with making it opt-out, which is say, unless you tell us you don't want to be an organ donor, we're going to assume you do. Okay? So does anybody know, I mean, you can probably look on your driver's license and see, are you an organ donor? There's usually a pretty identifiable symbol. So, I mean, this is not what New York's driver's licenses look like anymore. This is an old picture. But you see there's sort of that heart on the right side. The text is not really readable on this terrible image, but it says organ donor underneath it. And so you can check on your driver's license and see, are you registered as an organ donor? Which means should something terrible happen to you, if you are, maybe something good can come out of a really tragic event. And maybe, you know, even though you or me or whoever is no longer around, if your organs were still viable and still good, they can be used to save someone else's life. Okay? And so why then, thinking about this, I mean, that's sort of a grim outcome to talk about early on Monday morning, but why do most donated organs come from cadavers? Yep. Right, because most internal organs are unique. Okay, most of us here probably have one heart. I'm not going to say all of us do. I don't know what your family history is. I'm not aware of that being a common thing, but who knows? But the issue is, can you survive without your heart? No. So are you probably willing to donate your heart and you know, continue on with life? Probably not. Okay, so the joke here. Anyone's seen these demotivators? So you can have, here's your pyramid and sacrifice. All we ask here is you give us your heart. It's a Mayan temple. Okay, anyway, haha. Okay, so, but the idea is, you know, the organs come from cadavers because most people need the organs to live. And so it's only after that person has moved on that you can really think about trying to transplant something like the heart, or in some cases the liver, or other organs to a different person. But not all organs are unique. What's an organ that is actually redundant for some weird evolutionary reason in the human body? Kidneys. Most people have 2 kidneys. How many kidneys do you need to actually live? You only need 1. And so this sort of changed the game 30 years ago, when people started developing, well, even 60 years ago, kidney exchanges, because all of a sudden we no longer had to get kidneys from cadavers. In principle, every one of us in this room can donate 1 kidney and probably not notice a huge difference in your quality of life. Okay? And so if you're curious, I've got a link here also to a nice first-hand account of someone who did living donor kidney transplantation, where they said, I'm going to donate one of my kidneys, and talking about how the whole how the procedure worked, how they got registered as a kidney donor, how the surgeries worked, you know, keeping up. I think he, at the end of the article, talked about keeping in contact with the person who actually received the kidney, at least for a little while afterwards. And it's a really neat story. I would encourage you to take a moment and read it. But this is something that sort of changed the game, where after decades and or a century of transplants coming from cadavers, from dead bodies, we now have the possibility where that doesn't have to be true, which means we have a much larger pool of organs to deal with and to work with and to potentially transplant, which means we can potentially do what? Save more lives. Does that seem like a thing we should explore and try to maximize as much as possible? Yeah. Okay, so how does that end up working? Well, so it turns out, we'll get to that question, but there's some things we need to discuss first. So, you know, what are some of the problems with organ transplantation? Why can't we just go and immediately and just say, oh, it's working and here's a kidney and good for you? Okay, well, there are a whole bunch of issues. There's certainly more than what I've got listed on the slide here, but we can talk about some of them. On an economical or logistical front, how do we prioritize who gets the organs? You know, on whatever the organ is, whether it's a heart, whether it's a kidney, whether it's a liver, do we have an abundance of organs sitting around just waiting for people to need them? No, quite frankly, it's completely the other way around. We've got a whole bunch of people who need the organ, and we have a very small list of ones that are available. So how do we prioritize Who gets the limited resources? And this is a hard question to answer. Why is this a hard question to deal with? Because the people who don't get the organ die. Literally, there are life or death consequences. And so how do you make that prioritization? How do you try to make it as fair as possible? Do we want someone arbitrarily saying, live, die, live, die, live, die? No, we want this to try to be done as fairly and as objectively as possible. And what's the right way to do that? I don't know. I don't think anyone does. We have a system in place right now. Is it the best one we could develop? Maybe, maybe not. But this is something we have to take into account. So what are some factors that go into prioritizing people on organ donation lists? Okay, so their age. So typically someone who's younger is going to be given higher priority than someone who's older. And by younger, I mean like probably less than 50 versus older than 70. Okay? But that's certainly one consideration. What are some others? Right, so how sick they are. To some extent, or more likely, what's the prognosis for recovery? Because someone who's really sick, but the transplant will basically solve all of their medical problems, is probably going to get a higher priority than someone who's really sick, but the transplant's not going to solve all of their problems. Versus someone who's not really all that sick, but the transplant would solve all of their problems, is also going to be probably a little bit lower in priority. Absolutely. Economic standing. Let's live in an ideal world where that's not a condition, but yeah, it is. Okay. I'm not sure that necessarily should be one, but yes, it absolutely is. Money can buy things. I don't think that's a revelation to anyone in the room. Yep. Okay, so what's someone's dependency situation? Do they have children or other people that are dependent on them for well-being? That can be factored in, absolutely. Okay, their behavior. In some ways that can, but this is another one of those slippery slope issues. And so when you're saying behavior, what are you thinking? Right. So if it's a liver transplant, is this someone who's an alcoholic, or is this someone that needs a liver for a different reason? That might be taken into account. So in general, we try not to look at behavior, but there are certainly issues along those lines where we've said it's okay to look into that. Again, looking at the viability. Whereas we have, I don't know, let's say 10 livers to transplant, where are those 10 livers going to make the biggest amount of impact? And giving one to someone who's a chronic alcoholic is probably not the best use of those livers. Okay. So in that sense, yes, you're right. Behavior can absolutely factor in. Other ideas or thoughts? I mean, those are most of the ones that I'm aware of. Are there potentially others? Yep. Okay, so location can be one. That's actually a great segue to the next point. So now, think about location. How do we get a donated organ to the recipient? Do you think it's likely, or that you should count on it from a serendipitous perspective? You're over at Stony Brook Hospital, over on the other side of Nichols, and you're needing a kidney, and the person who happens to have the perfect kidney for you just walks into Stony Brook Medical. Could that happen? Sure. Great. Go buy a lotto ticket. I wouldn't count on it. More likely, the person who has the perfect kidney for you just walked into a hospital in Los Angeles. Well, does that do you a lot of good when you're here at Stony Brook? Not really. So there's a logistical issue. How do we get that organ to the person that needs it? Okay, well, as it turns out, in a lot of cases, keeping organs on ice, you can usually do most cases for about 48 hours. And with this wonderful technology called an airplane, is it really that hard to get something around the world in under 48 hours? Not necessarily. I mean, there can still be issues, but certainly logistical issues play a factor as well. We say this is the perfect match, but it's just not the most logistical thing. And so that can also help in the priority, or sort of move things around up and down a little bit. Absolutely. But that's another issue. How do we actually get the organ from point A to point B? Yep. Other thoughts sort of on economic or logistical issues? Okay, other questions that we can have with organ donation. Who's allowed to donate an organ? Should everyone be allowed to donate organs? Why might we not want someone to donate an organ? Because they've had different diseases. If someone's previously had liver cancer, do we want them donating their liver? Probably not. Okay? And so what are some of the limitations? And in certain cases, there are medical reasons why someone would not be allowed to donate an organ. Sometimes there are political reasons why someone is not allowed to donate an organ. I'm not going to go into what those might be, but you can look them up. Okay? And so there can be different reasons for that. Suppose now we're thinking about either the person's an organ donor and they're talking about donation before they die, like when they're declaring at the DMV that they want to be an organ donor, or suppose it's a living donation where I can actually donate a kidney. Does the person who's donating the organ get any say in who gets their organ? I don't know. From one sense, should the person be allowed to have some control over what happens to their organ? I mean, you can think from a sense, yeah, it's theirs right now. They can put a string on it if they want. Our government does that with aid and bailout money all the time. We'll give you medical aid if you don't talk about something. Let's not go into that issue. Okay, so sometimes maybe it's a family member. Sure, and you can say, well, I'm willing to donate my kidney, but I want it to go to, here's my brother. My brother needs a kidney, and I'm a match. I want my kidney to go to him. It doesn't just go to some random person. Is that something that you should be allowed to do? Can you see abuses to that system? In principle, should we try to mitigate those abuses? Yeah, so again, this is a slippery slope, and anytime you're dealing with these sort of ethical and moral issues, there's not often a clear right or wrong answer for how we go about doing this. Sort of from a legal perspective, building on that, can organs be sold? Okay, certainly from a legal perspective in this country, the answer is overwhelmingly no. I believe it's a felony in most states, certainly federally, to be selling human organs. Okay, that's not something you're allowed to do. But that's just a legal restriction. Should we necessarily want organs to be sold? This is going to go back to your issue, and then all of a sudden whoever has the money is going to get the organs. That's why we disallow it. In principle, it's supposed to sort of be the leveling field where we're then determining who gets the organs based on need, not based on financial background. But there's a whole bunch of issues here, and we'll come back and talk about some more of these on future slides. And then now getting into sort of the medical gist, dealing with thinking who gets paired, we want to look and say, can the recipient actually use the organ's donor, or the donor's organ, excuse me. Okay, because if we know from a medical reason that, I want to give you my kidney, but we're not matches, is there any reason to perform that surgery if you're just going to reject it? No, that's just a waste of resources. The surgeon's time, there goes a perfectly viable kidney that maybe I could have used or someone else could have used, and it's just gone now. And sort of what the medical field can start to help us do is to answer these questions and start getting into this, how do we match suitable donors to acceptors? So that, again, we can, from the economical perspective, make the best use of the limited resources we have. Okay? So there's a whole bunch. Does anybody have other questions that you come up with of sort of what are issues related to this? These are ones that I did, but by no means are these questions exhaustive.
Can the organ donor choose to kill themselves?
Okay, can the organ donor choose to kill themselves to donate an organ? That is certainly an interesting question that I believe right now, at least in this country, the answer would be no, unless you're in Oregon. Oregon has the Death with Dignity Act. You can, anyway, look it up. Okay. I think Washington actually now has it too, but that's relatively recent. Yep.
I was saying, I was watching, I think there was a movie called 7 Pounds of Will Smith. I think he did that. He got a jellyfish sting him, so he could die.
Okay, so there was the movie, what was it, the 7 Pounds? I remember the movie, I didn't see it, but you're saying where he sort of let the jellyfish sting him so that he would die. Okay, so death by jellyfish, or suicide by jellyfish. Okay. Let's not go down that slope. Other? Okay. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of other questions that could be asked, and I don't have answers for hardly any of these. But these are questions that you have to start thinking about. Again, when we're thinking about technology, what is its value to society, and what's the context? Are there potential abuses? Because I think you can see to a lot of these questions, especially the ones in the middle, if we're not careful, this could get out of control really, really quickly, and that's something we don't want. Okay? And so, sort of where we're going to focus our discussion over the next couple lectures is really around the question, how do we maximize the number of people who receive kidneys, again, thinking about kidney donation specifically because we have this live donation thing, where we don't necessarily need cadavers to come in, but how do we maximize the number of people who can receive kidneys given a pool or a registry of potential donors? Is this a question that we should probably be interested in solving? Yeah, this is going to save lives. The more people we can get these kidneys to, the better. Okay? So this has actually like major real-world impact. And it turns out In some regards, this is not a hard question to tackle. In other regards, it's an incredibly hard question to tackle. And we'll get into some of those issues. But what I want to do, first of all, is issue the warning. Unlike a lot of the previous units where we've actually come up with a pretty good solution strategy or been able to deal with the questions that we've asked. How many satellites did we need for GPS? Well, 3 or 4 depending on the clocks. How do we convert numbers and things and text files into ones and zeros? We answered those questions. We're not going to answer this question in full generality. We can answer parts of it. We can certainly set up ways to think about it. But actually solving the question, maybe in the full form, turns out to be a really hard problem to solve. Okay? And so we're just not going to be able to do it. But what we can do is sort of work on building up a toolbox. How do we think about this question? How do we address this question? How do we make headway on this question? And that's something we absolutely can do, and we will be doing in the next couple of lectures. So we can start with sort of this motivating example. And we've already sort of discussed this as we were talking about some of the questions. You need a kidney, and your brother's a match. And your brother's willing to donate you a kidney. Whose kidney are you going to get? You're going to get your brother's. Okay. Was this really that hard of an example? No. If you walk in, if you need an organ transplant, and you walk in with a donor who's willing to transplant to you, and you're a match, what are they going to do? You're going to get that organ. Okay. And this is a real possibility. I mean, this happens all the time, but it doesn't happen for everyone. And so the question is that we're going to be starting to deal with is, so you come in, you need this kidney, you need this organ donation, you bring a donor with you. Again, thinking in particular about kidneys where you can do the living donor exchanges. And so you now come in and you bring your brother, but you and your brother aren't a match. What happens? What goes on in that sense? And so there's some background readings. These are both posted to Blackboard. You can look them up online. I've also put up either links or PDF files to Blackboard as well, talking about how this works and the idea of matchmaking to try to find these different combinations together to match people that need kidneys with kidneys that are willing to be donated. Okay, and so the idea of what this leads to is this thing called a kidney exchange. Where basically what we're going to do is try to track people. So we know here's a person who needs a kidney, and they bring with them someone who's willing to donate. But, generally speaking, if they're on this registry, what's going to be true of that one donor and acceptor? They don't match. If they did match, what would happen? We'd just go do the surgery. Okay? But we're going to have all of these pairs of people. One's willing to donate, one needs the kidney. They don't match. And so what are we going to do? We're going to start collecting pairs of these people. Maybe Stony Brook Hospital is just keeping a list. Maybe this is more of a regional New York State thing. Maybe it's a New England thing or a Northeast thing. Maybe it's countrywide. Maybe it's international. I don't know. But we're going to start cataloging what are all of these different pairs of people saying, here's the type of kidney they need, here's the type of kidney they can donate. Okay? And so we're going to sort of put down a couple restrictions. And number one, we're going to insist, generally speaking, that anyone who needs the kidney is going to have to bring a donor with them. If you want to go on the exchange, there are ways to get around this in real life, and in real life exceptions are granted. But the idea that we're going to operate with is you have to come as the pair. You need a kidney, you've got a donor who's willing to give one. Medically, we can then start doing the screening and looking at things like blood types. We can look at the HLA proteins, which are part of the immune system, for identifying what your body thinks belongs in your body versus things that it doesn't think belong in your body. And so we can catalog all that. And this is where the medical science enters, because what is that information used to try to determine? Why would we care about someone's blood type or their immune system when thinking about organ donation? Are they going to accept or reject? So we're going to use medical science with that information to try to make a prediction, will the acceptor's body accept that organ? Because if we think that the recipient is going to just reject the organ, is that necessarily the best use of our limited organ resources? No, we probably don't want to do that transplant unless there's an overriding reason to try. Okay? And so then what we're going to do is by taking and collecting all of this information, who needs a kidney, who's willing to donate, and what are some of the medical considerations along with it, we can set up this idea of a kidney exchange. We've got this big registry, this big exchange of who's available, what's available, and who needs what. And so then what we can start to do is try to match people off of this, to try to say, how do we best arrange the kidneys and get people that are willing to donate kidneys and get their kidneys into people that need them where it's going to do the most good. Okay, and that's the general idea, and that's what we're going to be discussing over the next couple lectures. So some of you are wondering, and maybe you remember, back on the first day of class, I said we would look at an act of Congress at some point in this class. Again, talking about contextual information on why we have technologies. These types of exchanges, these living donor, in particular kidney exchanges, but there are other types of organs that can also be donated in this way. This has only been legal since 2007. Anybody want to take a guess? When did the first living donor kidney transplant actually occur? What do you think? Is it before or after 2007? It's probably long before. It's about mid-1980s when it happened. Which is to say, for about 20 years, anyone who did this type of transplant surgery, strictly by the law, I don't think anyone was ever tried, and certainly no one was convicted of it, but strictly speaking, they were felons. Why? Why was Organation doing this live kidney transplant, why was that illegal by the letter of the law? Okay, if anyone's here studying to be a lawyer or interested in law at some point, maybe you've heard of a phrase called quid pro quo. Anybody know what quid pro quo is, besides selling an Illinois Senate seat?
I do something for you, you do something.
Right, I do something for you, you do something for me. So think about this kidney exchange. I need a kidney, and I bring a donor who's willing to give me one, but we're not matches. Well, you need a kidney, and you've got a donor who's willing to give you one, but you're not matches. Well, but your donor matches me, and my donor matches you, but now my donor's only going to give to you if your donor gives to me. That is textbook quid pro quo. And we've generally decided as a society that that is not acceptable behavior. And so what did we have to do to say, do we want to discourage people from doing this type of behavior when it comes to organ transplants? No, this is actually a really good thing to do. So what did we have to do? We had to pass an act of Congress that decriminalized live donor donations. And so you can actually go and look. This is not a very long law. You can see it's on 2 pages of paper, and for whatever reason, the federal government still loves to use outrageously large margins on everything. But so, I mean, you can go through the text here, and this one's not even necessarily that hard to read. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of, okay, so first of all, this act may be cited as the Charlie W. Norwood Living Organ Donation Act. Amendments to the National Organ Transplant Act. Section 301 of the National Organ Transplant Act, 42 United States Code 274 Part E, is amended. 1. In subsection A, by adding at the end of the following, the preceding sentence does not apply with respect to human organ paired donation. Okay, so that previous sentence is probably talking about something like quid pro quo. Saying, yes, this organ donation, this is still technically, it's still a textbook case of quid pro quo, but it is no longer illegal. Okay? And so then they go through and they define out, so A, an individual referred to in this paragraph as the first donor desires to make a living donation of a human organ specifically to a particular patient, referred to as the first patient, but such donor is biologically incompatible as a donor for such patient. Okay. There's a lot of sort of mumbo-jumbo, but is this really that complicated? Like, this is not that hard to understand. Okay. So B, a second individual referred to as the second donor desires to make a living donation to a human organ specifically to a second particular patient, referred to as the second patient, but they are biologically incompatible. Okay. Subject to subparagraph D, the first donor is biologically comparable as a donor, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, you can go through and you can read this, but it's basically just saying, okay, you're allowed to do this. This is fine. Again, yes, technically it is still quid pro quo, but we are not going to classify it as a crime. We want to encourage people to do this. And so I would encourage, if you're curious, there's another 3 paragraphs to go. This is not one that's that hard to read. Section 3, okay, so the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall submit, annually thereafter, reports to the Congress on how many people are donating organs, how many people are receiving organs, where are they at, sort of on a national scale. Why would the Congress be interested in knowing geographically where are the organs being donated, how many organs are being donated, how many are being transplanted? Why would they be interested in knowing that information? Again, this all sort of goes into what's the context of the technology and what's the value. Is population distributed homogeneously throughout the United States? No, as it turns out, there are a lot of people living in Wyoming, and New York is a wasteland, right? Oh, wait, I got that. It's the other way around. So do you expect there are going to be a lot of organ transplants happening in Wyoming compared to New York City? No, you expect to see way more in New York City, seeing as there's 10 times the population in New York City than there's in the entire state of Wyoming. Okay? And so one of the jobs of the federal government by the Constitution is to regulate interstate commerce and cooperation. So is the United States Congress interested in where all of these things happening in a way to try to maybe make it more fair that someone in Wyoming still has equal opportunity to get an organ transplant despite the fact that they live in the middle of nowhere? Potentially, yes. Is Congress necessarily going to do anything about it? Maybe, maybe not. But they're interested in that information. And so these are things that they can collect, and they wanted to under this act. Okay. So then, still sort of warming up with some more examples here. So now suppose you have A-type blood, and you need a kidney. You bring a donor with you, but your donor is incompatible. So maybe this is your brother from the last slide, or sister, as the text would say here, and she has B-type blood. Okay, so you're incompatible. Your body's going to reject that kidney. Another living donor, somewhere else, has A-type blood, and is paired with an acceptor who has B-type blood. Can both you and the acceptor receive kidneys based on this information? What do you think? Sure. Okay, well, how are you going to do it? Are you going to get the kidney that your sister has? No, because you're incompatible. But you can do pretty much the swap here. The second acceptor has B-type blood, which means they can accept the B-type kidney that your donor is willing to give. You've got A-type blood, and their donor has A-type blood. And so we could do this paired matching by taking these two pairs, putting them together, and saying, well, you get this donor's kidney, and the other person gets that donor's kidney, and everybody wins. Again, this is a pretty simple example. And now as we start to scale this up, number one, we're going to sort of convert to a tabular format for what's going on, because I think if I had to write all this out with text, it would take longer than the entire slide. But now sort of here's a third example, as we sort of scale up a little bit. So now we've got 4 different pairs, and we can just label them. There's pair 1, pair 2, pair 3, pair 4. What is the blood type of the acceptor? What is the blood type of the donor? And we can ask ourselves now, so there's 4 different pairs. There's 4 people that need kidneys, 4 people willing to donate kidneys. Is it possible in this case that everyone can receive a kidney? If everyone can't receive a kidney, what's the best we can do? Okay? So I think this is probably a great place to end for the day. I'll post this on the slides. Think about this before Wednesday and try to work this out. How many people can get kidneys out of this? And then we're going to talk next time about how do we sort of generalize, and if we need to scale this up bigger and bigger and bigger, how is that going to work? So thank you for your attention, and have a wonderful afternoon.